Stanislav Petrov was not supposed to be working that night. It was September 26, 1983, inside a secret Soviet bunker outside Moscow. The screens in front of him were built for one purpose: to warn the Soviet Union if American nuclear missiles were coming. Just after midnight, the alarm sounded. 1 missile, then 2, then 5. The system said the United States had launched a nuclear strike. Protocol pointed in one direction, reported up the chain of command, and let the Soviet leadership respond. Petrov hesitated. 5 missiles made no sense. A real first strike would not begin with 5. It would come as a storm. Hundreds of warheads meant to overwhelm Soviet defenses before anyone could answer. The machines said one thing. His judgment said another. So he made the decision the system had not been built to make. He reported a malfunction. He was right. There were no missiles. A satellite had mistaken sunlight reflecting off clouds for rocket exhaust. The end of the world had appeared on a screen because of an error in the sky. Petrov received no medal, no promotion, no official celebration. Years later, when journalists told him he may have prevented a nuclear war, he seemed almost embarrassed. He had not been certain. He had made a guess. That is what the Cold War ultimately came down to. Not only presidents, not only generals, not only doctrines written in classified rooms, but human beings, alone with incomplete information, deciding whether to obey the system or doubt it. Some guessed right. Some almost did not. This is the story of how 2 nations that had just won a war together built a world that nearly destroyed them both. It begins, as many catastrophes do, with a victory. Chapter 1. The World After the Fire. Picture Europe in the summer of 1945. Not the Europe of textbooks, with its clean maps and its neat dates. The actual Europe, a continent where entire cities had been reduced to rubble, so complete that survivors described walking across streets they had lived on for decades without recognizing them, where the roads were clogged with tens of millions of displaced people moving in every direction. Refugees, liberated prisoners, demobilized soldiers, each carrying what they could and looking for something that might still exist, where the economies of ancient nations had been shattered so thoroughly that the most basic transactions had reverted to barter because the currencies meant nothing and the institutions that had given them meaning were gone. Between 70 and 85 million people were dead. The range itself is telling. The destruction had been so total, the record-keeping so disrupted, that humanity could not even count its own losses with precision. Into this wreckage, 2 nations looked at each other across the ruins, and each saw, for the first time with complete clarity, what the other actually was. The United States emerged from the Second World War in a position no country had ever occupied in modern history. Its territory was untouched. Not a single American city had been bombed. Not a single American factory had been seized. The war that had consumed the industrial capacity of Europe and Asia had instead turbocharged the American economy, which, by 1945, accounted for roughly half of the entire world's industrial output. The country that had entered the war with an army smaller than Portugal's had built, in 4 years, the most powerful military force in human history. And in August 1945, it had demonstrated a capability that changed every calculation on Earth. It had split the atom and turned the result into a weapon that could destroy an entire city in a single explosion. The Soviet Union had paid a price so staggering it resists comprehension. Estimates of Soviet dead in the Second World War range from around 27 million to roughly 30 million. with some scholars placing the figure higher, reflecting both the genuine uncertainty of wartime record-keeping and the catastrophic scale of what the country had endured. What those numbers represent, translated into individual lives. Is this a country where almost every family had lost someone? Where entire regions had been occupied and systematically looted and burned? Where the Western Soviet Union looked, in the words of one American diplomat who traveled through it in 1946, like the surface of the moon. The Red Army that had bled its way from the ruins of Stalingrad to the center of Berlin was the largest and most battle-hardened land force on Earth. But the nation it served had been half destroyed in the process of saving itself. These two nations had been allies. They had fought together. Their soldiers had embraced at the Elbe River in April 1945 in photographs that seemed to promise a different kind of future. Their leaders had sat together at Yalta in February of that year and divided the post-war world between them with the confidence of men who believed the future was theirs to arrange. They were wrong about that confidence, and the wrongness of it would define the next half-century. The historian John Lewis Gaddis, whose work on the Cold War remains among the most careful and comprehensive available, has argued that the American-Soviet alliance was always a marriage of necessity rather than conviction. The two systems were not merely different. They were built on premises so fundamentally incompatible that prolonged cooperation required each side to ignore what the other actually was. American capitalism rested on private property, free markets, and the belief that individual liberty was the foundation of legitimate government. Soviet communism rested on collective ownership, central planning, and the belief that the party that understood the arc of history had the right, indeed the obligation, to direct society toward its inevitable destination. These were not policy disagreements. They were different theories of what human beings were and what human society should look like. And each theory, taken seriously, viewed the other not merely as wrong, but as a threat to its own existence. Franklin Roosevelt had believed, or had allowed himself to hope, that personal relationships could bridge this gap. He thought he could manage Joseph Stalin the way he managed American politicians, through the patient cultivation of trust and the assumption that reasonable men could reach reasonable accommodations even across profound differences. He died in April 1945, 3 weeks before Germany surrendered, before the evidence that this assumption was wrong had fully accumulated. Harry Truman inherited the presidency with almost no preparation for it. Roosevelt had kept him nearly uninformed about the war's most sensitive matters, including the atomic bomb project. Truman learned about the bomb from his briefers after taking office. He learned about the state of relations with Moscow the same way, from advisors who were themselves uncertain about what Soviet leadership actually intended. What became clear within weeks was that the Soviets intended to keep what they had taken. Poland was the first and most visible conflict. At Yalta, the three leaders had agreed that Poland would have a government broadly representative of Polish political life, with free elections to follow. What Stalin implemented was different. The government he installed in Warsaw was a Soviet creation. Its opposition systematically intimidated, arrested, or removed when American and British diplomats objected. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov responded with a consistency that left no ambiguity about Moscow's position. Poland was on the Soviet border. The Soviet Union had been invaded from the West twice in living memory. The question of who governed Poland was, from Moscow's perspective, a question of Soviet survival, not Polish democracy. Both positions had their own logic. Both logics were irreconcilable. The atomic bomb made everything more dangerous and more complicated simultaneously. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The explosion killed somewhere between 70,000 and 140,000 people, most of them civilians, and destroyed approximately 5 square miles of city in a fraction of a second. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. The Second World War ended. Stalin had known about the Manhattan Project through Soviet intelligence before Truman casually mentioned at the Potsdam Conference in July that the Americans had developed a new weapon of unusual destructive force. The mention was not a revelation. It was confirmation, and it transformed Stalin's strategic position in the most alarming possible direction. The Soviet Union's great advantage was its army. Decades of industrialization had built a military colossus that could overwhelm Western Europe in a conventional war. The atomic bomb made that advantage strategically uncertain. No matter how many soldiers the Red Army fielded, no matter how many tanks it built, the United States could now threaten to reduce Soviet cities to ash from the air. The monopoly on atomic weapons gave America a form of leverage that Stalin found, correctly, intolerably. His response was to make its elimination the highest priority of the Soviet state. Lavrentiy Beria, the feared head of the Soviet secret police, was given control of the Soviet atomic program with instructions that admitted no possibility of failure. The means Beria employed included the forced labor of thousands of prisoners in uranium mines, the extraction of every piece of technical information that Soviet intelligence had gathered from spies inside the Manhattan Project, and the conscription of the entire Soviet scientific establishment into a project that consumed resources the country could barely spare. Meanwhile, the question of Europe's future was producing open conflict at every negotiating table. The United Nations, founded in San Francisco in June 1945, with genuine hope that it might replace the old system of power politics with something more rational, was already paralyzed by the fundamental disagreement between its two most powerful members. The Security Council veto that both the United States and the Soviet Union possessed meant that any action either side objected to was impossible. The institution created to manage global security had become instead the stage on which the confrontation it was designed to prevent played out in public. Across Eastern Europe, the pattern was consistent. Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, in country after country, Soviet-backed communists were consolidating power through a combination of electoral manipulation, intimidation of opposition parties, and the quiet removal of politicians who could not be controlled. The governments that emerged were not independent. They were extensions of Soviet authority, answerable to Moscow. Winston Churchill, who had left office in the British election of July 1945, but remained the most recognizable voice in the Western world, gave the speech that named what was happening on March 5, 1946, at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. Standing beside Truman, who had introduced him, Churchill described a line running from Stettin on the Baltic to Trieste on the Adriatic, behind which every capital of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe lay in what he called the Soviet sphere. An iron curtain, he said, had descended across the continent. Stalin's response compared Churchill to Hitler. The comparison was propaganda, but it revealed something about how the Soviet leadership framed what was developing. In Moscow's telling, Western concern about Eastern Europe was not genuine concern for democracy. It was the opening move of a new campaign to encircle and destroy the Soviet Union. The same campaign that fascism had attempted. Now wearing a democratic mask, the man who gave the American response its intellectual framework was a relatively junior diplomat named George Kennan, serving at the American Embassy in Moscow. In February 1946, Kennan sent Washington an 8,000-word telegram that became one of the most consequential documents in American diplomatic history. The Soviet leadership, he wrote, was not a normal government that could be engaged through normal diplomacy. Its foreign policy was driven by a combination of traditional Russian imperial insecurity and Marxist-Leninist ideology that required external enemies to justify internal repression. It would always probe for weakness. It would always expand wherever it encountered no firm resistance. The policy Kennan recommended was containment, not military confrontation everywhere on the globe, which he explicitly did not advocate, but the maintenance of firm counter-pressure at the specific points where Soviet expansion was most dangerous, primarily Western Europe and Japan. Over time, he argued, the internal contradictions of the Soviet system would cause it to moderate or collapse. American patience and steady resistance were the right instruments. Kennan's telegram made him famous inside the government. It also, almost immediately, was misread in ways that frustrated him for the rest of his very long life. Washington heard a mandate for global military resistance to Soviet expansion anywhere it occurred. Kennan had meant something far more limited and specific. The gap between what he intended and what policymakers took from his analysis would cost hundreds of thousands of lives in places he had never meant his framework to apply. By the end of 1947, the architecture of the confrontation was in place. 2 blocks, 2 ideologies, 2 sets of nuclear calculations already diverging from anything that could be called rational. The Cold War had begun, in the sense that the name implies, not with armies in the field, but with the systematic construction of opposed worlds, each organized around the assumption that the other represented an existential threat. What neither side had yet fully grasped was how long it would last, how many lives it would consume in the places where it turned hot, and how many times, in the decades ahead, it would come within a single human decision of becoming something far worse. George Kennan understood some of this. He was already worried, in late 1947, that the framework he had helped create was being used in ways he had not intended and could not control. He would spend the next 5 decades watching that worry prove justified. In Korea and Vietnam and a dozen other places where the Cold War's abstract logic met the concrete reality of people dying. The abstract logic was already moving toward its first concrete test. Chapter 2. Drawing the Line. George Kennan had a habit of writing things down when he was troubled. In the months after his long telegram made him briefly the most celebrated analyst in Washington, as he watched his careful argument for limited, primarily political containment being transformed into something he did not recognize, he wrote memorandum after memorandum, trying to correct the record. The Soviet threat was real, he argued, but it was not primarily military. The right response was not a global military commitment, but a targeted effort to strengthen the specific societies where Soviet political influence posed the greatest danger: Western Europe, Japan, a handful of other critical nodes. Nobody with the power to act on his analysis was listening in the way he needed them to listen. This gap between the careful original idea and the expansive political use made of it would become one of the Cold War's defining patterns. Policymakers needed frameworks simple enough to explain to Congress and the public. Kennan's framework required judgments about which threats were genuinely dangerous and which were peripheral, which interventions were worth their costs, and which were not. Simplicity won. The speech Truman delivered before Congress on March 12, 1947, committed the United States in language so broad that it could justify American intervention almost anywhere on earth. I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. There was no geographic limit. There was no threshold of strategic importance. There was only the binary free peoples and the forces attempting to subjugate them. Senator Arthur Vandenberg, one of the most important Republican foreign policy voices in Congress, had told Truman's advisors before the speech that if the administration wanted congressional support for aid to Greece and Turkey, Truman would need to, as Vandenberg put it, scare the hell out of the American people. The speech did exactly that. It was a political success and a strategic overcommitment simultaneously. Two things that are not always easy to separate in the moment they occur. The Marshall Plan, announced by Secretary of State George Marshall at a Harvard commencement address in June 1947, was Kennan's idea implemented closer to his intentions than most of what followed. It was targeted, economic, and addressed a specific vulnerability: the collapsing Western European economies that were making communist parties electorally competitive in France and Italy. Over 4 years, roughly $13 billion flowed into Western European reconstruction, funding the economic revival that transformed the continent. The communist parties that had seemed poised to make significant electoral gains found themselves competing against a capitalism that was actually delivering rising living standards. They lost. Stalin rejected the Marshall Plan for the Soviet Union and pressured his Eastern European satellites to reject it as well. He understood, correctly, that accepting American economic assistance would create dependencies and open channels of influence that would undermine Soviet control. The rejection was rational from a Soviet strategic perspective. Its cost was paid by the populations of Eastern Europe, who watched the western half of their continent rebuild while they lived under a system that could not deliver what it promised. The Marshall Plan required a security guarantee to function properly. Businesses would not invest in reconstruction. Governments would not make difficult economic reforms. People would not plan for a future without confidence that the Soviet army would not simply march westward and take what American money had rebuilt. The North Atlantic Treaty, signed in April 1949, provided that guarantee. 12 nations committed themselves to treating an attack on any one of them as an attack on all. The United States had entered its first permanent peacetime military alliance, committing itself in advance to Europe's defense regardless of the specific circumstances that might produce a conflict. The city that made the commitment feel urgent, that gave it a concrete face rather than an abstract strategic logic, was Berlin. The former German capital sat like an island of Western presence deep inside the Soviet occupation zone of Germany. By the terms of the post-war settlement, it had been divided into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet, with Western access guaranteed by corridor agreements that had seemed reasonable in 1945 and increasingly vulnerable as the relationship between the occupying powers deteriorated. In June 1948, the Western powers announced a currency reform in their occupation zones, a step toward creating a separate West German economic entity. Stalin responded by cutting all land and water routes into West Berlin. No trucks, no trains, no barges. 2 million West Berliners were cut off from their supply lines. Stalin's calculation was that the Western powers would either abandon the city or attempt to break the blockade by force. Either outcome served Soviet interests. Truman chose a third option. The Berlin airlift lasted 322 days. At its peak, a cargo aircraft landed at Tempelhof Airport every 45 seconds. Around the clock, American and British pilots flew in coal, food, medicine, and everything else a city of 2 million people needed to survive. 39 British and American aircrew died in accidents during the operation. Stalin had no good response. He could not shoot down unarmed cargo aircraft without committing an act of war he was not prepared for. In May 1949, he lifted the blockade. West Berlin had survived. More than that, it had been transformed in Western public consciousness from a logistical problem into a symbol. The city that had been the capital of the regime that started the Second World War had become, in the space of less than a year, the front line of the defense of freedom. The same month, the blockade ended. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb. The American nuclear monopoly was over. Washington had assumed the Soviets were years away from this capability. The assumption was wrong, partly because Soviet science was more capable than American intelligence credited, and partly because Soviet espionage had penetrated the Manhattan Project deeply enough to compress the development timeline significantly. The physicist Klaus Fuchs, a German-born British scientist who had worked at Los Alamos, had been passing detailed technical information to Soviet intelligence throughout the war. He was identified and arrested in early 1950. 3 months after the Soviet bomb test, Mao Zedong stood in Tiananmen Square and proclaimed the People's Republic of China, the most populous country on earth, had gone communist. In Washington, the question of who had lost China became a political firestorm that consumed careers and poisoned foreign policy debates for years. The framing itself revealed something about the assumptions driving American policy. China was not America's to lose. But the Cold War framework that divided the world into a binary of pro-American and pro-Soviet made it difficult to see it that way. The document that most clearly revealed where American strategy was heading was completed in April 1950, 3 months before the Korean War began. National Security Council Document 68 argued that the Soviet threat was so severe and so imminent that the United States had no choice but to massively rearm. Defense spending needed to roughly quadruple. The entire posture of American engagement with the world needed to shift to military preparedness on a scale the country had never maintained in peacetime. Korea provided the political conditions that allowed its recommendations to be implemented. And Korea was coming faster than anyone in Washington had fully prepared for. The line had been drawn, on both sides of it. The machinery of confrontation was being built at a pace and on a scale that would make the Cold War not merely a political rivalry, but a permanent condition of existence. Woven into the budgets, the institutions, and the domestic politics of both superpowers in ways that would prove extraordinarily difficult to unwind. Kennan watched all of this with what his diary entries from the period describe as something close to despair. He had tried to give Washington a precise instrument. Washington had used it as a sledgehammer. The consequences of that substitution were about to become visible in a peninsula in East Asia, where the Cold War's abstract logic would collide with the reality of artillery and infantry and 36,000 American dead. Chapter 3. The First Fires. On the morning of June 25, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel before dawn with 90,000 soldiers in Soviet-supplied tanks, moving so fast that South Korean units they hit first ceased to exist as coherent military formations within hours. the South Korean capital of Seoul fell in 3 days. The remnants of the South Korean army and the small American force stationed in the country were pushed into a desperate fighting retreat that did not stop until they had been compressed into a small perimeter around the port city of Pusan, in the peninsula's southeastern corner. The invasion was a shock in Washington, but not because the possibility of conflict in Korea was unforeseen. American intelligence had been tracking North Korean military buildups for months. The shock was the speed and completeness of the assault, and the specific, uncomfortable question it forced: what was the Truman Doctrine actually worth, if not this? What did a global commitment to resist subjugation mean, if it did not mean responding here? Truman committed American forces within days, operating under a United Nations Security Council resolution that was possible only because the Soviet representative had been boycotting the council over a separate dispute and was absent from the vote. It was the first major test of containment as a military strategy rather than a political one. And it began with the United States barely holding a corner of a peninsula it had not adequately prepared to defend. The general commanding American forces in Asia was Douglas MacArthur, 70 years old, a figure of such outsized personality and undeniable military capability that working with him was, for every civilian authority above him, an exercise in managing someone who believed his own judgment superior to theirs. In September 1950, MacArthur executed one of the most audacious military operations of the 20th century, an amphibious landing at Incheon, a port on the western coast of Korea, far behind the North Korean front lines, cut the enemy's supply lines, and collapsed the invasion in a matter of weeks. The move was one that his own Navy had argued was operationally impossible given the extreme tidal conditions at Incheon. MacArthur overruled them and was proven right. Within weeks, South Korea had been liberated, and American and Allied forces were standing at the 38th parallel with the North Korean army in ruins ahead of them. It was the moment that revealed the gap between containment as Kennan had intended it and containment as the people prosecuting it understood it. Containment meant holding the line. The mission was to restore the situation before the invasion, not to use the opportunity to destroy the North Korean state and unify the peninsula by force. But with the North Korean army shattered and the possibility of total victory suddenly visible, stopping felt like waste. MacArthur wanted to go north. Much of Washington agreed. Truman authorized the advance. Beijing had sent explicit warnings through diplomatic channels that China would not tolerate American forces approaching its border at the Yalu River. The warnings were discounted. American intelligence assessed, wrongly, that China would not intervene. In late October 1950, 250,000 Chinese troops crossed the Yalu River and struck the advancing American and Allied forces with a ferocity that produced one of the most catastrophic reverses in American military history. Units that had been advancing confidently northward found themselves fighting for survival in temperatures that dropped to 30 degrees below zero. The Marines at the Chosin Reservoir fought their way out of complete encirclement through 17 days of combat in conditions so extreme that weapons failed. Wounds froze, and men who stopped moving died within hours. They called it Frozen Chosin, and the men who survived it carried the memory for the rest of their lives with an intensity that the word trauma does not adequately capture. The war stabilized roughly where it had begun, near the 38th parallel. 2 years of negotiations followed, conducted in a tent at Panmunjom while the fighting continued and the casualties accumulated. The armistice was signed on July 27, 1953. The border ended up almost exactly where it had been before the first shot was fired. 36,000 Americans were dead. The South Korean dead numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The peninsula had been devastated in both directions by 3 years of fighting that ended where it began. MacArthur did not survive the war in the political sense. His public statements contradicting American policy. His implication that he should be allowed to expand the war against China. Statements that his critics read as opening the door to dangerous escalation. Represented exactly the kind of military independence from civilian control that Truman understood could not be tolerated in the nuclear age. Truman fired him in April 1951. MacArthur returned home to ticker-tape parades in New York and a hero's reception before a joint session of Congress. Truman's approval rating collapsed. The political cost was severe. The principle was sound. In the nuclear age, civilian control of the military was not a formality. It was a survival mechanism. The precedent Truman set, that generals served the president and not the other way around, would matter at moments far more dangerous than Korea. The Korean War also accelerated the militarization of the Cold War in ways that permanently altered American society. The garrison state, an America that would maintain massive military forces indefinitely, not for a specific war, but as a permanent condition of existence in the nuclear age, was being built with a speed that would have seemed unimaginable 2 years earlier. The war itself brought the Cold War home in a different way. The men who served in Korea came back to a country where the question of communist infiltration of American institutions had become a political weapon of extraordinary force. Korea had demonstrated that American soldiers were dying to contain communism. That fact gave enormous political energy to those who argued that communism was also advancing inside America itself. In government departments, in universities, in the film industry, in the military. Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin had announced in February 1950 that he possessed a list of communists in the State Department. The announcement arrived in the specific political atmosphere that Korea was intensifying week by week. And it landed with a force that no purely domestic political controversy could have generated. The war overseas and the witch hunt at home fed each other. Each casualty report from Korea made McCarthy's accusations feel more urgent. Each McCarthy headline made the war feel more necessary. The fear of communist infiltration was not entirely without foundation. Soviet intelligence had genuinely recruited agents at significant levels of the American government, military, and scientific community. The Rosenbergs were real. Alger Hiss was real. The question was whether the threat justified the response. McCarthy's list changed size and composition with remarkable frequency. The evidence behind it was thin to non-existent. But the charges, amplified by a press corps that discovered McCarthy was extraordinarily good for circulation, created a political environment in which accusation became functionally equivalent to guilt. Government employees lost their positions after loyalty hearings that offered few procedural protections. Universities dismissed faculty. The Hollywood blacklist destroyed careers on the basis of past political associations. The effect was to narrow the range of acceptable opinion about foreign policy precisely when the Cold War's complexity required the widest possible engagement with difficult questions. McCarthy met his end in the spring of 1954 through television. The Army McCarthy hearings, broadcast nationally, allowed the American public to watch him operate in real time. The Army's counsel, Joseph Welch, delivered the question that punctured the senator's hold on public opinion. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency? The audience fell silent. McCarthy had no good answer. The Senate voted to censure him later that year. He died in 1957. But McCarthyism, as a political culture, outlasted its creator. The association of dissent with disloyalty shaped American political discourse for years and was the domestic price a democracy paid for organizing its politics around an existential external threat. It was, in a sense, the Cold War's first domestic casualty, a wound the country inflicted on itself. The Korean War demonstrated that the Cold War could turn hot at the periphery and that the most powerful military in history could be fought to a standstill when political constraints prevented the full application of that power. The lesson pointed directly toward Southeast Asia. It would take another decade before the application was attempted, and another decade after that before the full cost was understood. Meanwhile, in laboratories and conference rooms, in classified programs, and private research institutions, a group of men were working out the logic of a world where both superpowers had weapons capable of destroying civilization. Understanding what they came up with is essential to understanding everything that follows. Chapter 4. The Nuclear Shadow. Herman Kahn was a large, rumpled man with a gift for saying things that made his audiences deeply uncomfortable. He worked at the Rand Corporation, the research organization in Santa Monica that the Air Force had founded in 1948 to think rigorously about nuclear strategy. Rand assembled some of the finest analytical minds the country could find and set them to work on a single underlying question. How do you think rationally about weapons that could end civilization? What does strategy even mean when the ultimate instrument of your strategy is the destruction of both sides? Kahn's answer, developed through the 1950s and published in his 1960 book on thermonuclear war, was that you thought about it exactly as you would think about anything else. You identified the variables. You constructed the scenarios. You calculated the outcomes. If 10 million Americans dead was the alternative to 100 million Americans dead, then the strategy that produced 10 million was the correct choice. This was not callousness, Kahn insisted. Only by thinking clearly about actual consequences could you hope to minimize suffering. His lecture audiences, which included military officers, government officials, and academics, often sat in silence when he finished. Then, someone would ask a question that revealed they were not entirely sure whether they had just heard a genius or a madman. Kahn's response was always some version of the same point. The madness was not in thinking about nuclear war. The madness was in not thinking about it. Across the country, another man was thinking about it from a very different angle. Robert Oppenheimer had led the Manhattan Project, the program that built the first atomic bomb. He had watched the Trinity test in New Mexico in July 1945 and recalled afterward a line from Hindu scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." He was not speaking metaphorically. He understood, better than almost anyone alive, what the weapon he had built was capable of. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Oppenheimer argued against the development of the hydrogen bomb on both strategic and moral grounds, a weapon 1,000 times more powerful than the one that had destroyed Hiroshima was not, in his view, a logical extension of deterrence. It was something qualitatively different, a device whose only conceivable military purpose was the mass killing of civilians on a scale that no strategic doctrine could make acceptable. He said so to the people who had the power to make the decision. He was overruled. In 1954, in one of the more shameful episodes of Cold War domestic politics, Oppenheimer's security clearance was revoked After hearings that combined genuine questions about his past associations with a political vendetta by officials who found his moral reservations about nuclear weapons professionally inconvenient, the man who had given America its most consequential weapon was effectively destroyed professionally for expressing doubts about what America should do with it. The contrast between Kahn and Oppenheimer was not simply a contrast between two personalities. It was a contrast between two ways of relating to the weapons that defined the era. Kahn's approach treated the weapons as problems to be managed through rigorous analysis. Oppenheimer's approach treated them as a moral condition that required a different kind of reckoning. The institutions of American strategic planning chose Kahn. The question of whether they chose correctly is one the Cold War's history has not definitively answered. The intellectual framework that Kahn and his colleagues at RAND developed became the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. The acronym was MAD. The analysts who coined it were aware of the irony. A world made safe by the certainty of its own annihilation was, by any ordinary moral standard, insane. But within the internal logic of nuclear deterrence, it was, theoretically, the most stable possible arrangement. Both sides had every incentive to maintain the capability to absorb a nuclear attack and still retaliate with devastating force. That capability was the foundation of deterrence. Remove it, and deterrence collapsed. The first American hydrogen bomb test. In November 1952, at Eniwetok Atoll in the Pacific, produced an explosion roughly 500 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. It vaporized an entire island. The crater left behind was a mile wide and 200 feet deep. The Soviets tested their own hydrogen bomb 9 months later. The weapons that had seemed unimaginably destructive in 1945 now looked almost modest compared to what had replaced them. Eisenhower, who took office in January 1953, brought to nuclear strategy an understanding that came from his experience as a military commander rather than a theorist. He had organized the largest military operation in history at Normandy. He had seen what industrial-scale war looked like at its worst. He was genuinely frightened by the direction the arms race was taking and expressed that fear privately with a directness that rarely made it into public statements. His strategic response was a doctrine called massive retaliation, articulated by Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. The logic was economic as much as strategic. Conventional forces were expensive. Nuclear weapons, relative to their destructive power, were cheap. If the United States could deter Soviet aggression anywhere in the world by threatening nuclear retaliation against the Soviet Union itself, the savings in conventional military spending would be enormous. More bang for the buck was Dulles's phrase, and it captured both the strategic concept and its fundamental problem in 4 words. The problem was credibility. Threatening to start a nuclear war over a border skirmish in some distant corner of the world required a willingness to risk the destruction of American cities that became less believable the more carefully anyone examined it. As Soviet nuclear capability grew, the threat of massive retaliation became not more credible, but less. The doctrine that was supposed to deter everything was increasingly convincing as a deterrent of almost nothing, except a direct nuclear attack on the United States itself. The Sputnik launch in October 1957 brought the nuclear shadow into every American living room in a new and visceral way. The satellite itself was modest by technical standards, an aluminum sphere roughly the size of a beach ball, transmitting a radio signal that amateur operators around the world could receive on shortwave receivers. But it was in orbit. The Soviet Union had a rocket powerful enough to put an object in space. A rocket powerful enough to do that was capable of delivering a nuclear warhead to any city in the United States. The reaction in America was not simply political anxiety. Though it was that too. It was something closer to a crisis of identity. The country that had built the atomic bomb first, that had assembled the most productive industrial economy in history, was not supposed to be beaten into space by a country that could not reliably manufacture consumer goods. Eisenhower knew from classified U-2 reconnaissance flights over the Soviet Union that the missile gap, which politicians were using to frighten the public, was largely a myth. Soviet missile capability, while real and growing, was significantly less than the worst-case estimates driving American defense spending. He could not say so publicly without revealing the surveillance program. He absorbed the political criticism and watched the anxiety spread. The U-2 program itself illustrated the gap between the clean logic of strategy and the messy reality of operations. On May 1, 1960, a U-2 piloted by Francis Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union by a new surface-to-air missile. Powers survived, ejected, and was captured. The Eisenhower administration issued a cover story about a weather research aircraft that had strayed off course. Khrushchev waited for the lie, then produced Powers and the wreckage at a moment calculated for maximum embarrassment. The Paris summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev, representing perhaps the best opportunity for a genuine reduction in Cold War tensions during the entire Eisenhower presidency, was destroyed. Eisenhower gave his farewell address in January 1961. The passage that has echoed through American political culture ever since warned against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by what he called the military-industrial complex, the entanglement of military contractors, defense bureaucracies, and political interests that had grown up around the permanent military establishment the Cold War had created. What made the warning remarkable was its source. This was the Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe in the Second World War, warning that the institutions he had helped build were developing interests of their own that might not always align with the national interests they were supposed to serve. He was right. He was also leaving office, and the warning arrived without sufficient institutional force to change the trajectory of what he was describing. The nuclear shadow that had fallen across the world in 1945 was deeper and darker in 1961 than it had been when it first appeared. Both superpowers had weapons capable of destroying modern civilization and killing hundreds of millions of people, with cascading effects on climate, agriculture, and human survival that no model could fully predict. Both had delivery systems fast enough to make warning times almost meaningless. Both had command and control systems complex enough that their behavior under the extreme stress of actual crisis was genuinely uncertain. The men who had built these systems believed they had created stability. Kahn was confident the calculus worked. Oppenheimer was not so sure. And Oppenheimer was no longer in a position to say so officially. The machines and the men inside them were about to be tested in ways that none of the strategies had modeled with sufficient fidelity. The test would come from a small island 90 miles off the coast of Florida, and it would last 13 days that the people who lived through them later described, with a consistency that spoke to genuine experience, as the most frightened they had ever been in their lives. Chapter 5. SPIES, Lies, and Proxy Shadows. There is a version of the Cold War that exists in official histories and political speeches. In that version, two systems competed openly, each making its case to the world, with the better system ultimately prevailing. Then there is the version that actually happened. Consider what took place in Tehran in August 1953. The democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, had nationalized the Anglo-Iranian oil company the previous year. placing Iranian oil under Iranian control. The British government, which held the majority stake in the company, was furious. The Eisenhower administration, viewing the situation through the lens of containment and persuaded by British intelligence assessments that Mossadegh's government was vulnerable to communist influence, agreed to act. What followed was not diplomacy. CIA officers working under cover identities organized paid crowds in Tehran streets. They cultivated relationships with military officers who could be persuaded to move against the government. They ran a propaganda operation designed to undermine public confidence in Mossadegh's leadership. The operation had a code name: Ajax on the American side, Boot on the British side, and it was conducted entirely in secret, without the knowledge or consent of the Iranian people whose government was being removed. The coup succeeded. Mossadegh was arrested. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had fled during the crisis, returned to his throne, and the United States had demonstrated, in a way that would shape every subsequent interaction with the Middle East, that its commitment to democracy was conditional on whether the democracy in question made decisions Washington approved of. The CIA had been created in 1947 to collect and analyze intelligence about Soviet capabilities and intentions. Almost from the beginning, a second function grew alongside the first: covert action, the ability to intervene in the affairs of other countries secretly, shaping political outcomes without the accountability that overt action required. If you could change a government through a coup rather than a war, the savings in blood and treasure were obvious. The logic was compelling. The consequences, more often than not, were not what the planners expected. Guatemala, in 1954, followed the Iranian template almost exactly. President Jacobo Arbenz had implemented a land reform program that expropriated unused land from the United Fruit Company, an American corporation with significant political connections in Washington, and distributed it to Guatemalan peasants. The Eisenhower administration authorized an operation called PBSUCCSS that combined propaganda, support for a small exile army, and psychological warfare tactics to produce a military coup. Arbenz resigned. The land reform was reversed. Guatemala entered decades of military rule and civil conflict. Declassified CIA documents from later decades indicate that American officials themselves came to acknowledge the intervention had consequences that extended well beyond its intended scope. Neither Iran nor Guatemala had been in any meaningful sense a Soviet operation. Both Mossadegh and Arbenz were nationalist politicians pursuing domestic agendas. The Cold War framework, which divided the world into a binary of pro-American and pro-Soviet, made it difficult for Washington to distinguish between genuine communist expansion and independent nationalism that simply did not align with American preferences. The two things looked the same through the lens of containment, and the consequences of misidentifying one as the other were paid by the populations of the countries where the identification was wrong. The Soviet intelligence apparatus ran its own parallel universe of covert operations, recruitment, and influence. The KGB combined foreign intelligence with internal security functions that the CIA, operating in a democratic society with legal constraints, could not replicate. It surveilled the Soviet population. It managed the security of the communist bloc. It recruited agents in Western countries with a patience and systematic thoroughness that produced results whose full extent took decades to document. The most damaging Soviet intelligence success in the West was a group of British men recruited while students at Cambridge University in the 1930s. They had been young idealists who looked at the Depression, at the rise of fascism, and at what the Soviet experiment seemed to represent, in contrast, and had made a choice whose consequences they could not have fully foreseen. By the time the choice had fully expressed itself, they had penetrated the highest levels of British and American intelligence and had been passing secrets to Moscow for nearly 2 decades. Kim Philby was the most damaging. He rose to become head of the anti-Soviet section of MI6 and served as the MI6 liaison to the CIA in Washington. He was, in other words, the officer whose job was to coordinate intelligence operations against the Soviet Union, and he was warning Moscow about those operations in real time. The agents who died because of his betrayals. The operations that failed because he had compromised them in advance. Represented a cost that cannot be precisely quantified because much of the damage remains classified. Philby defected to the Soviet Union in 1963. He lived in Moscow for the rest of his life. Given a senior position within the KGB, according to various accounts, in an apartment that by Soviet standards was comfortable and by Western standards was modest, he gave occasional interviews to Western journalists that combined genuine intelligence with studied performance. The spy who had crossed the most consequential line of the Cold War, explaining himself to the world he had betrayed with a clarity that only deepened the unease. The covert dimension of the Cold War continued with an energy that the official diplomatic history consistently underrepresents. When John Kennedy inherited the presidency in January 1961, he also inherited a CIA operation already in motion, a force of Cuban exiles, trained and equipped on Guatemalan soil, preparing to invade Cuba and overthrow Fidel Castro, who had taken power in Havana in January 1959 and moved Cuba firmly into the Soviet orbit. Kennedy was uncomfortable with the operation but unwilling to cancel it. He approved it with modifications that the CIA's planners believed had fatally compromised its chances. Most significantly, a reduction in the air support that was supposed to destroy Castro's air force before the landing. On April 17, 1961, roughly 1,400 Cuban exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs on Cuba's southern coast. It was a disaster of almost perfect completeness. The popular uprising against Castro that the CIA had predicted did not materialize. The Exile Brigade, without adequate air cover, was overwhelmed by Cuban forces that were better organized and defending their own soil. Within 72 hours, the operation had collapsed. Over 1,100 men were captured and spent more than a year in Cuban prisons before Kennedy negotiated their release. The Bay of Pigs failed on every dimension simultaneously. It did not remove Castro. It demonstrated American incompetence to the world in the most public possible way. It pushed Castro more firmly into Moscow's embrace, creating the very situation it had been designed to prevent. And it led Nikita Khrushchev to a conclusion about the new American president that the historical record suggests he found useful. Khrushchev appears to have concluded that Kennedy could be pressured, that the young president, faced with a crisis, would hesitate rather than act with decisive force. That reading would prove dangerously incomplete. But he would not discover its incompleteness until 13 months later, in circumstances that made the original miscalculation almost unforgivably dangerous. Chapter 6. The week the world almost ended. Robert McNamara was 85 years old when he sat down with the documentary filmmaker Errol Morris and described, for the first time with full candor, what he had experienced during the Cuban Missile Crisis 40 years earlier. McNamara had been Kennedy's Secretary of Defense. He had been in the room for every ExComm meeting, every argument, every moment when the 13 days of October 1962 might have gone differently. He had lived with the knowledge of how close it had come for 4 decades before he spoke about it publicly with the specificity that Morris's film captured. "We came that close to nuclear war," he said, holding his thumb and index finger a fraction of an inch apart. "That close." He paused. "And I want to say, and this is very important at the end, we lucked out. It was luck that prevented nuclear war." This was not the official account of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The official account was a story of American resolve and superior crisis management, of Kennedy's steady nerves and Khrushchev's eventual retreat. That account was not false, but it was incomplete in ways that matter enormously for understanding not just what happened in October 1962, but what it tells us about the world those 13 days left behind. To understand why the missiles were in Cuba in the first place, you have to stand inside Khrushchev's strategic position in the summer of 1962. The Soviet leader faced a nuclear balance that was worse than most Western analysts understood at the time. The United States had deployed Jupiter ballistic missiles in Turkey, placing American nuclear weapons on the Soviet border. American strategic bombers could reach Soviet cities from bases across Western Europe and the Pacific. The Soviet intercontinental ballistic missile program, despite the impression Sputnik had created, was significantly behind the American one. The actual nuclear balance in 1962 favored the United States by a substantial margin that the Soviet leadership knew about, and American intelligence was only beginning to accurately assess. Against this background, Khrushchev proposed to his Presidium in May 1962 that the Soviet Union deploy medium and intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Cuba. The deployment would serve several purposes simultaneously. It would deter another American attempt to overthrow Castro. It would partially redress the strategic nuclear imbalance by placing Soviet weapons 90 miles from the American coast. And it would give Khrushchev leverage in the ongoing confrontation over Berlin. The operation was conducted in what Khrushchev believed was secrecy. Soviet ships carrying missile equipment, launch vehicles, and over 42,000 military personnel began arriving in Cuba through the summer. American intelligence detected unusual Soviet military activity, but did not identify the missiles specifically until October 14, when a U-2 reconnaissance flight over western Cuba produced photographs that were analyzed and brought to the White House 2 days later. Kennedy assembled the small group of advisors that became ExComm and made his first consequential decision immediately. Keep it secret from the public while options were developed. Give himself time to think before the political pressure of public knowledge foreclosed the space for careful deliberation. What happened in ExComm over the following days was not the smooth operation of a well-designed crisis management system. It was a group of extraordinarily intelligent and experienced men arguing with increasing intensity about choices none of them had been trained to make. Under time pressure that prevented careful analysis, with imperfect information about Soviet intentions and Cuban conditions, the military, almost unanimously, favored an immediate airstrike to destroy the missiles before they became operational. The Joint Chiefs argued that American air power could eliminate the threat cleanly, and that the window for doing so was closing as the missiles approached operational status. What American intelligence did not know during the crisis, and what Soviet archives revealed decades later, was that Soviet forces in Cuba already possessed tactical nuclear weapons. The question of their use under certain conditions, including a potential American invasion, was subject to instructions from Moscow that were being revised and tightened as the crisis deepened. This gap in American knowledge was one of several ways in which the airstrike option was significantly more dangerous than its advocates understood at the time. Kennedy was skeptical of the airstrike for reasons his military advisors were not fully crediting. An airstrike on Cuba was an act of war. Khrushchev could not absorb it without responding somewhere. The most likely response was Berlin, where Soviet conventional forces could overwhelm the small Western garrison. A crisis that started as nuclear missiles in Cuba could end as a conventional war in Central Europe that escalated by steps that were individually explicable and collectively catastrophic into something neither side had intended. The option Kennedy chose after days of argument was a naval blockade, which the administration called a quarantine for legal reasons, combined with a direct demand that the missiles be removed. Kennedy announced the quarantine to the American public on the evening of October 22 in a television address that told Americans, for the first time, what was 90 miles off their coast. The reaction across the country combined fear and a strange kind of clarity. This was not the abstract threat of nuclear war that had been background noise for a decade. This was a specific crisis, with a specific geography, unfolding in real time. The Soviet ships approaching the quarantine line continued steaming toward Cuba. The first critical moment came on October 24, when the Soviet ships approaching the line either stopped or turned back. Dean Rusk, Kennedy's Secretary of State, told his colleagues, "We're eyeball to eyeball." And I think the other fellow just blinked. The immediate crisis of a direct confrontation at sea was averted, but the missiles were still in Cuba, still being assembled. The diplomatic channel that produced a resolution ran simultaneously through official and private pathways. Khrushchev sent Kennedy 2 letters in rapid succession. The first was relatively conciliatory, suggesting a possible deal. The second was more formal and publicly demanding the removal of American Jupiter missiles from Turkey in exchange for Soviet missiles leaving Cuba. Kennedy and his advisors faced a genuine dilemma. The Jupiter missiles in Turkey were, as Kennedy acknowledged privately, obsolete. He had already ordered them removed before the crisis began, and the order had not been implemented. Trading them for the Soviet missiles in Cuba was, in purely strategic terms, a reasonable exchange. The problem was public appearances. Accepting the trade openly, under Soviet pressure, would look like capitulation and would undermine American credibility, with allies watching to see whether Washington would sacrifice their security to resolve an American problem. The solution was negotiated in a private meeting on the evening of October 27 between Robert Kennedy and Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba. The Americans would pledge not to invade Cuba. The Jupiter missiles in Turkey would be removed, quietly, within a few months, in a process not publicly connected to the Cuban settlement. The private arrangement would not be acknowledged for nearly 30 years. October 27th was also the day the crisis came closest to producing the catastrophe the negotiators were working to prevent, and it did so through events that had nothing to do with the diplomatic channel making progress toward resolution. That morning, a U-2 on an air sampling mission in the Arctic strayed accidentally into Soviet airspace over Siberia due to a navigation error. Soviet fighters scrambled to intercept it. American fighters in Alaska scrambled in response. For a period measured in minutes, armed aircraft from both superpowers were airborne in a potential combat situation at the most dangerous moment of the most dangerous crisis of the Cold War. The U-2 found its way back to Alaska. Nobody fired. Nobody had ordered the overflight. It happened because complex systems operating under extreme stress do not always behave as their operators intend. The same day, A U-2 over Cuba was shot down by a Soviet surface-to-air missile, killing the pilot, Major Rudolf Anderson. The ex-com's standing orders called for automatic retaliation against the site that had fired. Kennedy overrode the orders. He was not going to allow an incident that neither side had fully controlled to push the crisis into a shooting war. At the moment, a diplomatic resolution was within reach. And then there was the submarine. The American Naval Task Force enforcing the quarantine had located a Soviet submarine, designated B-59, near the quarantine line and was attempting to force it to surface by dropping practice depth charges. The charges were a standard signaling procedure, not intended to damage the submarine. Inside B-59, the communication was received very differently. The submarine had been at sea for weeks. It had been operating under radio silence. It had no way of knowing whether a war had started while it was submerged. The practice depth charges, experienced from inside the hull, sounded like actual attack. The commanding officer, Captain Valentin Savitsky, believed he was under attack. He had nuclear torpedoes. Their use required the agreement of 3 officers. Savitsky wanted to launch. The political officer agreed. The third required officer was the flotilla commander, Vasily Arkhipov, who was aboard B-59, traveling with the submarine rather than commanding it. Arkhipov refused to authorize the launch. He argued that the pattern of depth charges was wrong for an actual attack, that they should surface and verify before doing anything irreversible. The argument was conducted in the confined heat of a submarine that had been running with minimal ventilation for weeks, among exhausted men who believed they might be dying. Arkhipov held his position. B-59 surfaced. The resolution came on October 28th. When Khrushchev announced over Radio Moscow that Soviet missiles would be withdrawn from Cuba, Kennedy publicly accepted the terms of the first Khrushchev letter. The private arrangement about the Turkish missiles was not mentioned. The world stepped back from the edge. What emerged in the years afterward? As archives opened and participants began speaking more candidly, was a picture of those 13 days that differed from the official account in ways that matter. The diplomatic skill of both Kennedy and Khrushchev was real. The back-channel communication that produced the private deal showed genuine creativity under pressure. Kennedy's decision to pursue the blockade rather than the airstrike, and his willingness to override his military advisors at critical moments, required genuine courage. These things are true. It is also true that Arkhipov held his position in the heat of a submarine and saved the negotiation from being overtaken by an accident nobody had ordered. It is also true that a U-2 strayed into Soviet airspace by mistake on the most dangerous day of the crisis. The margin between the world that existed and the world that might have existed was thinner than the official history acknowledged for a long time. As McNamara said in his old age, they lucked out. Somewhere in Moscow at that moment, a man named Stanislav Petrov was serving his career in the Soviet military, unaware that 19 years later he would face a moment of his own. The weapons that had come so close to being used in October 1962 were still there. They would be there for decades more. The question of whether the judgment and the fortune that had preserved the margin in 1962 would hold in the crises that were still to come had not been answered. It had only been deferred. Chapter 7. Vietnam and the Limits of Power. Robert McNamara kept a photograph on his desk at the Pentagon. It was not a photograph of presidents or generals or the famous men he had worked alongside during his years at the center of American power. It was a photograph of his son Craig, taken during one of the anti-war marches that were filling the streets of American cities by the late 1960s. Craig McNamara opposed the war his father was running. he said so publicly. The father kept the photograph where he could see it every day. What that photograph meant to McNamara, what he was doing with it, whether it was penance or pride or something he could not name, he never fully explained. But it captures something true about Vietnam that the strategic documents and the body count statistics do not. The war did not stay in Southeast Asia. It came home, into families, into living rooms, into the space between fathers and sons. And it tore through American society with a force that left marks still visible decades later, 12,000 miles away from McNamara's desk. In a village in the Mekong Delta in 1966, a woman named Nguyen Thi Hoa was doing what she had done every morning of her adult life. She was tending her family's rice paddies before the heat made the work unbearable. She was 23 years old. She had a husband who had been conscripted into the South Vietnamese army and a daughter who was 2. She had, in the way that people in the middle of historical events rarely do, no particular sense that she was living inside something that would be written about for the next half-century. What she knew was that the planes came over every few days, that sometimes they dropped things, that the village chief had told the families with young children to sleep in the bunker behind the communal hall, that her neighbor's brother had joined the Viet Cong the previous year and that her neighbor never talked about it, that the Americans had built a base camp 15 kilometers to the north, and that you could sometimes see their helicopters from the top of the dike at the edge of the paddies. Her daily reality, multiplied across the millions of people who lived in the countryside of South Vietnam, was the thing that the strategic frameworks developed in Washington could not see and therefore could not account for. The domino theory could explain why Vietnam mattered to American interests. It could not explain why Nguyen Thi Hoa and people like her would keep fighting, keep absorbing losses, keep resisting an enemy with vastly superior firepower, for years past the point that the body count metrics said they should have stopped. That gap between what the frameworks could see and what was actually happening on the ground was the fundamental failure of the American war in Vietnam. And understanding it begins with understanding the theory that made the war feel, to the men who made the decisions, not merely justified but necessary. The domino theory was Eisenhower's formulation, offered in a press conference in April 1954, to explain what was at stake in Southeast Asia. If one country fell to communism, its neighbors would follow, toppling like a row of dominoes across the map. The image was vivid, and the logic had a surface plausibility. Communist movements were genuinely active throughout the region. The Chinese Revolution had demonstrated that communism could succeed in Asia. Korea had shown that the United States would fight to contain it. The question that the domino theory did not answer, and that policymakers did not press with sufficient rigor, was whether the specific dynamics of each country in the proposed chain were actually connected in the way the theory assumed. Whether a communist Vietnam would inevitably produce a communist Thailand in the same way that knocking over one physical domino inevitably knocked over the next. It would not. The theory was wrong in its specific application to Southeast Asia, where nationalist motivations, ethnic conflicts, and local political dynamics were far more determinative than any ideological transmission belt from Hanoi to Bangkok. But the theory was operational American policy for 2 decades, and its wrongness had a cost measured in millions of dollars. The Vietnamese communist movement was simultaneously both things that American policymakers could not hold in mind at once. It was genuinely communist, led by Ho Chi Minh with real ideological conviction and real organizational connections to both Moscow and Beijing. And it was genuinely nationalist, the latest expression of a Vietnamese resistance to foreign control that stretched back through a century of French colonialism and centuries before that of Chinese domination. Ho Chi Minh had quoted Thomas Jefferson in the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence in 1945. He had appealed to the United States for support against the French, citing Wilsonian principles of self-determination. Washington had declined, unwilling to undermine French membership in NATO for the sake of Vietnamese independence. The failure to see both dimensions simultaneously, to understand that the most dangerous enemy was not simply a communist, but a communist nationalist with genuine popular support derived from a cause that had nothing to do with Moscow, was the analytical failure at the root of everything that followed. The French fought their colonial war in Vietnam from 1946 to 1954 with increasing American financial support and decreasing military success. The war ended at Dien Bien Phu, where General Vo Nguyen Nguyen Giap's forces surrounded and destroyed a French fortified position through 56 days of siege. The defeat demonstrated that a Western army, with all its technology and firepower, could be beaten by a force it dramatically outmatched on paper. If that force was fighting for something it believed in, on terrain it knew, the lesson was available. It was not learned. The Geneva Accords of 1954 divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, with nationwide elections scheduled for 1956 to reunify the country. The Eisenhower administration concluded, almost certainly correctly, that Ho Chi Minh would win any honest nationwide election. It therefore supported South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem in refusing to hold them. The United States was now committed to defending a government whose existence depended on blocking the democratic process it claimed to represent. Kennedy increased the number of American military advisors in South Vietnam from roughly 900 at the end of the Eisenhower administration to more than 16,000 by November 1963. Whether he would have escalated further or found a way to withdraw is one of the most debated questions in American historical scholarship. He was assassinated before the decision became unavoidable. The question fell to Lyndon Johnson. Johnson did not want this war. His ambitions were domestic: Medicare, Medicaid, civil rights, voting rights, the war on poverty. These were the achievements he had worked his entire political life toward. He told his biographer, Doris Kearns Goodwin, years later, that he had understood from the beginning that a major war in Vietnam would consume the Great Society, that Congress would not fund both indefinitely, that the war would take everything. He escalated anyway. The political logic was immediate and felt overwhelming. The Republican right, which had made the question of who lost China a decade-long weapon against democratic foreign policy, would destroy a democratic president who presided over another communist takeover in Asia. Johnson had watched what anti-communist politics had done to Truman. He was not going to be the president who lost Vietnam. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, passed by Congress in August 1964, following an incident involving American destroyers and North Vietnamese forces, gave Johnson essentially unlimited authority to use military force in Southeast Asia. The first incident, on August 2, was real. The second, on August 4, was far less certain. A combination of nervous sonar operators, bad weather, and the specific anxiety of men in a combat zone who found what they were looking for in ambiguous data. Johnson knew the evidence for the second incident was uncertain. He used the resolution anyway. The man Johnson trusted most to manage the war was Robert McNamara, and McNamara's approach to Vietnam revealed both his extraordinary intelligence and the specific limitation that made that intelligence dangerous in this context. McNamara believed that any problem could be broken down into its component variables, quantified, analyzed, and managed toward an optimal outcome. He had done this successfully at Ford Motor Company. He had done it in the early years at the Pentagon in ways that genuinely improved defense management. Vietnam was not a management problem. It was a political and human problem that resisted quantification in ways his framework could not accommodate. The metric he relied on most heavily was body count, the number of enemy combatants killed in a given period. If American forces were killing more enemy fighters than could be replaced, the war was being won. The assumption was wrong. It measured military attrition and said nothing about political legitimacy. A South Vietnamese government that could not generate the loyalty of its own rural population, the loyalty of people like Nguyen Thi Hoa, and the millions of farmers and village workers whose support, or at least acquiescence, was the prerequisite for everything else, was losing the war regardless of what the body count said. By the end of 1965, more than 180,000 American troops were in Vietnam. By 1968, the number exceeded 500,000. American aircraft were conducting what military historians have described as the most intensive bombing campaign in history, striking North Vietnam and the supply routes through Laos and Cambodia with a weight of ordnance that staggered anyone who tried to comprehend it. The countryside of South Vietnam was being systematically transformed through bombing, chemical defoliation, and the forced relocation of rural populations into strategic hamlets designed to separate them from the Viet Cong. The Tet Offensive arrived on January 31, 1968, and broke something that could not be repaired. Tet is the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, traditionally observed with an informal military truce. In the early hours of January 31, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched coordinated attacks on more than 100 South Vietnamese cities and towns simultaneously. They hit the American embassy compound in Saigon. They held the ancient imperial capital of Hue for 25 days in some of the most brutal urban combat of the war. They hit provincial capitals across the country in attacks so widespread that no single response could address them. By the military metrics that McNamara had built American strategy around, Tet was an American victory. The attacking forces suffered catastrophic losses. The popular uprising against the South Vietnamese government that Hanoi had hoped to trigger did not materialize. The Viet Cong infrastructure in the South was severely damaged in ways that took years to rebuild. It did not matter. The American public had been told, in the months before Tet, that the war was being won. Administration officials had conducted what the press called a progress offensive in late 1967, a coordinated series of public statements designed to reassure Congress and the public that the corner had been turned. The images that came out of Tet, the fighting in the streets of Saigon, the assault on the embassy, the photograph of South Vietnamese Police Chief Nguyen Ngoc Loan executing a Viet Cong prisoner on a Saigon street in front of a wire service photographer, told a story that contradicted everything the administration had been saying with a visual force that no press release could answer. Walter Cronkite, the CBS News anchor who was at that moment probably the most trusted voice in American journalism, traveled to Vietnam after Tet and broadcast a documentary on February 27, 1968, that concluded the war was mired in stalemate. He said it in his own voice, departing from journalistic convention to offer his own assessment. Johnson watched the broadcast and reportedly told an aide that if he had lost Cronkite, he had lost Middle America. 3 weeks later, he announced that he would not seek re-election. The Pentagon Papers a secret Defense Department history commissioned by McNamara himself and leaked to the New York Times and Washington Post in June 1971 by former analyst Daniel Ellsberg, confirmed what the credibility gap had suggested. Multiple administrations had continued escalating a war they privately doubted could be won, because the political cost of acknowledging failure seemed worse than the cost of continuing. The papers showed systematic deception of Congress and the public, not as isolated episodes, but as institutional practice. Nixon pursued a strategy called Vietnamization, gradually transferring combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces while withdrawing American troops. The Paris Peace Accords, signed in January 1973, ended direct American military involvement. They did not end the war. In April 1975, North Vietnamese forces entered Saigon. The last Americans were evacuated from the embassy roof by helicopter. In images that have defined the word humiliation in American foreign policy vocabulary ever since, 58,000 Americans were dead. Vietnamese, dead. Military and civilian across both sides, numbered in the millions. Though estimates vary significantly with methodology and source, the most powerful military in history had not altered the outcome that the defeat at Dien Bien Phu had already suggested was coming. What Vietnam demonstrated, at a cost that no subsequent strategic document has fully reckoned with, was that military supremacy does not translate automatically into political outcomes, that the willingness of a population to absorb casualties in defense of their own soil and their own political vision is a form of strategic depth that firepower cannot simply overcome, and that a democracy fighting a prolonged war of uncertain purpose faces constraints that accumulate over time in ways that the initial decision to commit rarely accounts for. McNamara spent the last decades of his life trying to understand what had happened and why. His conclusion, arrived at through years of reflection and eventually articulated in meetings with his former Vietnamese counterparts, was that the fundamental failure had been a failure to understand what the other side was actually fighting for. He had counted bodies. He had not counted convictions. The photograph of Craig on his desk had been trying to tell him something about the limits of quantification for years. It had taken decades to hear it clearly. Somewhere in the Mekong Delta, Nguyen Thi Hoa's village survived the war. What it survived, and what it cost, is the part of the story that the strategic histories tend to leave out, and that the people who actually lived through Vietnam never forgot. The Soviet Union watched Vietnam carefully. It drew conclusions. Some of those conclusions were correct. One was dangerously wrong, and that wrongness would become apparent in a country where the mountains were different, but the logic was the same. Chapter 8. Détente and its Discontents. Richard Nixon arrived in Beijing on February 21, 1972, and the world tilted on its axis. The man who had built his career on the most aggressive anti-communism in American politics, who had made his national reputation hunting communists in the State Department, who had spent 2 decades positioning himself as the hardest of hardliners against the Marxist world, stepped off Air Force One onto Chinese soil and shook the hand of Zhou Enlai. 2 days later, he toasted Mao Zedong in the Great Hall of the People. He stood on the Great Wall and said it was a great wall. The reaction among those who had watched Nixon's career was something between genuine surprise and cognitive dissonance. Only Nixon, the commentators said, could go to China. The line captured something real. The anti-communist credentials that made the move politically possible for Nixon would have made it politically impossible for any Democrat. Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, had been working toward this opening since taking office in January 1969. Their intellectual framework was realpolitik, the European tradition of statecraft that evaluated foreign policy by its effectiveness in advancing national interests rather than its conformity to ideological principle. The Cold War, in this framework, was not primarily a moral struggle requiring ideological commitment. It was a competition between great powers that could be managed through the careful calibration of incentives and pressures. The China opening was realpolitik at its most elegant. The Sino-Soviet split, the deepening hostility between the two communist giants that had produced open border warfare in 1969, had created a triangular strategic situation that Kissinger recognized as an opportunity. If the United States developed a working relationship with China, the Soviet Union would face the prospect of American alignment with its most dangerous rival on its eastern flank. The triangle gave Washington more leverage than the bilateral American-Soviet confrontation had previously provided. 3 months after Beijing, Nixon flew to Moscow for a summit that produced the first strategic arms limitation treaty, SALT I, signed in May 1972, limited the number of intercontinental and submarine-launched ballistic missiles each side could deploy. It froze the arms race at existing levels rather than reducing it. And it was denounced within months by critics who argued that the asymmetries in the agreement favored the Soviets. The criticism was not entirely wrong, but it missed what SALT I actually represented. 2 nuclear superpowers had, for the first time, formally acknowledged that the arms race had costs that exceeded its benefits at the margin and had created institutional machinery to manage it. The Helsinki Accords of August 1975 were the broadest expression of détente, and the one whose consequences its architects least anticipated. To understand what Helsinki actually meant, it helps to stand in the shoes of someone who was not in the conference room, but who would be shaped by what came out of it. Consider someone like a Lithuanian schoolteacher in the city of Vilnius in 1976, the year after Helsinki was signed. Lithuania had been an independent nation until 1940, when Soviet annexation had incorporated it into the Soviet Union. The annexation had never been recognized by the United States throughout the Cold War. A school teacher in Vilnius would have known this history. She would have taught around it, carefully, in a system that required her to teach something else. Then imagine her colleague showing her the text of the Helsinki Final Act, the document that the Soviet government had signed. The passage about respecting human rights and fundamental freedoms, including freedom of thought, conscience, religion, and belief. She reads it twice. The Soviet government signed this in public before 35 nations, and the words are not ambiguous. Helsinki monitoring groups formed across the Soviet bloc within months of the accords being signed. Citizens organizing to document their government's violations of commitments those governments had made in writing. In Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in the Soviet Union itself, people who had seemed to have no mechanism for challenging the system found one in the document their governments had signed. Kissinger, who had negotiated Helsinki as a concession to Soviet interests, was privately skeptical of the human rights provisions. His realpolitik framework had limited patience for moral commitments that complicated great power management. He was wrong in this case. The Helsinki process proved, over the following 15 years, to be one of the most consequential instruments for internal pressure on the Soviet system that the West possessed, not through military force or economic coercion, but through the steady application of the Soviet bloc's own publicly stated commitments against its actual behavior. But the limits of détente were becoming visible as clearly as its achievements. The fundamental problem was that Washington and Moscow understood détente differently. Kissinger and Nixon conceived it as a comprehensive framework that would moderate Soviet behavior across the board. The Soviets understood it as a framework for managing the strategic nuclear relationship while continuing to pursue their interests elsewhere through support for revolutionary movements and proxy forces. Angola in 1975 made the gap undeniable. Cuba deployed tens of thousands of troops to support a Soviet-aligned faction in the Angolan Civil War. A direct intervention in a developing world conflict conducted in the middle of the détente period. Congress. In the aftermath of Vietnam and the Watergate scandal, cut off American funding for counter-operations. Détente had not prevented the proxy competition. It had simply changed the terms on which it was conducted. The collapse came from the mountains of Central Asia. In April 1978, a communist coup brought a Soviet-aligned government to power in Kabul. The new government attempted to modernize Afghan society at a pace and in ways that generated immediate violent resistance from a deeply conservative rural population. By 1979, a full-scale insurgency was underway, and the Afghan communist government was losing. On December 24, 1979, Soviet forces crossed into Afghanistan in what their leadership expected to be a stabilization operation lasting a few months. They were there for 10 years. The Carter administration had begun covert support for the Afghan resistance in the summer of 1979, months before the Soviet invasion. Zbigniew Brzezinski, Carter's national security advisor, later gave an interview in which he suggested the covert support was designed partly to draw the Soviets into a costly conflict, though historians have noted that his account of the program's precise intentions, given years after the fact, should be read with the caution appropriate to retrospective claims about policy motivations. Carter's public response to the invasion was swift. The SALT II Treaty, signed 6 months earlier after years of negotiation, was withdrawn from Senate consideration. American grain sales to the Soviet Union were partially embargoed. The United States led a boycott of the Moscow Olympics. Carter announced what became the Carter Doctrine, declaring that any attempt by outside forces to gain control of the Persian Gulf region would be met by any means necessary, including military force. Detente was over. The period that had produced genuine achievements, the arms control framework and the Helsinki process, whose consequences would take years to fully manifest, had lasted less than a decade. It had also demonstrated the limits of any framework built on the assumption that two ideologically incompatible powers could agree on the rules of their competition while they were actively competing. The man who replaced Carter in January 1981 had no interest in managing the competition. He intended to win it. Chapter 9. The Second Cold War. Ronald Reagan believed something that the foreign policy establishment considered naive when he entered office and struggled to explain when the Cold War ended. He believed the Soviet Union was dying, not weakening, not entering a period of strategic difficulty from which it might recover. Dying, in the specific sense that a system built on premises fundamentally incompatible with human nature and economic reality could not sustain itself indefinitely, and that American policy should be designed to accelerate its dissolution rather than accommodate its continued existence. The Soviet economy by 1981 provided genuine evidence for this assessment. Growth had stalled. The technological gap with the West had widened dramatically. Soviet consumer goods were of such poor quality that the gap between official claims about the system's performance and the lived experience of the people inside it had become impossible to paper over. The oil price collapse of the mid-1980s would cut Soviet hard currency earnings by roughly half, squeezing both military spending and the consumer goods that were supposed to demonstrate socialism's superiority. Afghanistan was draining blood and treasure with no end visible. Reagan's approach combined several instruments deployed simultaneously with an ideological consistency that the détente framework had never attempted. The defense buildup reversed the spending trends of the Carter years and drove American military expenditure to levels not seen since the Korean War period. The B-1 bomber was revived. A new generation of land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles was funded and deployed. The Navy pursued a 600-ship fleet. Each new American capability required a Soviet response. Each Soviet response required investments that the Soviet economy was increasingly poorly positioned to sustain. The Reagan Doctrine extended American support to anti-communist resistance movements around the world. In Afghanistan, CIA support for the Mujahideen was dramatically expanded, eventually including Stinger anti-aircraft missiles that transformed the ability of Afghan fighters to shoot down Soviet helicopters. The weapon system that had given Soviet forces their greatest tactical advantage. The Reagan Doctrine was aggressive and morally complicated in ways that its proponents did not always fully acknowledge. The movements it supported were not uniformly committed to democratic values. The question of what would happen when the common enemy was gone, when the groups being armed and trained no longer had a shared purpose that aligned with American interests, was not seriously asked at the time. Some of those long-term consequences would become visible only after the Cold War ended, in the instability that followed across Afghanistan and the wider region in the years that came after. On March 23, 1983, Reagan appeared on national television and announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a research program aimed at developing the capability to intercept Soviet ballistic missiles in flight. The goal, he said, was to make nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. The scientific community's reaction was almost uniformly skeptical. Physicists from institutions across the country argued that the technological challenges were insurmountable within any foreseeable time frame. The program acquired a nickname from its critics: Star Wars. The Soviet reaction was more alarmed than Western scientists expected. Moscow was not necessarily convinced that the system Reagan described was achievable, but they recognized that even a partially effective missile defense, combined with the American offensive buildup already underway, could threaten the second strike capability that was the foundation of Soviet deterrence. Responding to that possibility required investments that the Soviet economy was not equipped to make. Whether Reagan understood this strategic pressure effect clearly from the beginning, or arrived at it through a genuine belief in the program's defensive potential, is a question historians have not definitively resolved. What is not contested is that Star Wars functioned as strategic pressure, regardless of its technical prospects. The most dangerous moment of the Reagan years arrived not from deliberate escalation, but from a convergence of misperception and institutional momentum that came terrifyingly close to catastrophe. The Soviet intelligence services had been running an operation called Ryan since the early 1980s, monitoring for signs of American preparations for a nuclear first strike. The operation reflected a genuine concern within parts of the Soviet leadership that Reagan's rhetoric and the military activities of his administration were moving the United States toward a more aggressive posture. Whether this concern was entirely sincere or partly institutional, it shaped how Soviet intelligence interpreted American behavior. In September 1983, a Soviet interceptor aircraft shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 after it strayed into Soviet airspace over Sakhalin Island, killing all 269 people aboard. Reagan called it a crime against humanity. Soviet leaders called the American reaction a provocation. The already poisoned atmosphere became more toxic. In November 1983, NATO conducted a large command post exercise called Able Archer 83, simulating the procedures for releasing nuclear weapons. Soviet intelligence, already primed by Ryan to look for signs of American attack preparations, interpreted Able Archer as potentially covering preparations for an actual strike. Soviet nuclear forces went to an elevated state of readiness. Some Soviet aircraft in Eastern Europe were loaded with nuclear weapons and placed on alert. Information about the Soviet reaction to Able Archer reached Western intelligence through several channels, including material provided by the KGB officer Oleg Gordievsky, who was secretly working for British intelligence and whose reporting was conveyed to senior Western officials in the period that followed. Reagan's private diary entries from this period reflect a man who was genuinely disturbed by what he had learned. He had understood his confrontational rhetoric as pressure on a failing system. He had not fully absorbed how that rhetoric looked from the other side, how the words evil empire and the military activities surrounding them appeared to men who were already looking for evidence of American first strike preparation. The experience moved Reagan in ways that his critics found difficult to process. The man who had called the Soviet Union an evil empire began, in the second term of his presidency, to pursue dialogue with Soviet leadership with a seriousness that did not fit the ideological caricature of either his supporters or his opponents. The opportunity arrived in March 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev was 54 years old, a generation younger than his immediate predecessors. He was vigorous, intelligent, and possessed of something that distinguished him sharply from every Soviet leader since Khrushchev. He understood that the system was in serious trouble and was willing to consider changes that his predecessors had refused to contemplate. Reagan and Gorbachev met for the first time in Geneva in November 1985. The meeting produced no specific agreements. It produced something both leaders later identified as essential to everything that followed a personal relationship. Two men who had been communicating through the distorting lens of nuclear-armed confrontation discovered, in direct conversation, that the other was a human being with his own fears and his own desire to avoid catastrophe. Chernobyl intervened in April 1986 before the relationship could be tested in negotiation. The explosion of reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in northern Ukraine was not only a nuclear accident, it was a system failure that Gorbachev could not avoid seeing clearly. The reactor had been operated in ways that violated basic safety protocols under pressure from officials who did not want to delay a scheduled test. The initial response prioritized appearances over safety. The scale of the disaster became internationally visible on April 28, 2 days after the explosion, when monitoring stations in Sweden detected elevated radioactivity and workers at the Forsmark nuclear power plant triggered radiation alarms upon arriving for their shifts, prompting Swedish officials to begin asking questions that Moscow was not yet prepared to answer honestly. For Gorbachev, Chernobyl confirmed the diagnosis he had already made. A system that could not report honestly about a nuclear accident that had created such layers of institutional fear between the people who knew what had happened and the people who needed to know, was a system that was generating catastrophes through its own pathologies. The transparency he was trying to introduce was not merely a political preference. It was, he came to believe, a survival requirement. Reagan and Gorbachev met again at Reykjavik in October 1986, in a summit that came closer to a comprehensive nuclear agreement than any meeting before or since. Over 2 days of sessions that left their advisors astonished and alarmed. The two leaders discussed the elimination of all nuclear weapons within 10 years. They were further from the conventional assumptions of deterrence doctrine than anyone had ventured in the history of the nuclear age. The talks broke down over Star Wars. Gorbachev insisted that any agreement required confining the Strategic Defense Initiative to laboratory research. Reagan refused. The summit ended without the sweeping agreement that had seemed possible. Both leaders emerged visibly shaken by the opportunity that had slipped away. But Reykjavik's failure produced a more modest success. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed in Washington in December 1987, eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons. It was the first arms control agreement to actually reduce nuclear arsenals rather than merely cap them. It included verification provisions that previous Soviet leadership had always rejected. The INF Treaty was possible because Gorbachev had reached a conclusion that the Soviet leadership had been unwilling to face for decades. The military competition with the United States was not sustainable. The economic foundation was not there. The technological capacity was not there. The choice was between reform that risked the system's stability and continuing the competition that was slowly destroying its economic foundation. Gorbachev chose reform, and the reforms he chose because he was trying to save the system rather than replace it, were not radical enough to address its fundamental problems and too radical for its existing structures to absorb without coming apart. The empire was not stabilizing. It was beginning, in ways that Gorbachev had not intended and could not fully control, to dissolve. Chapter 10. The Empire Cracks. Mikhail Gorbachev had a theory. The theory was that the Soviet system was fundamentally sound, but had been corrupted by decades of Stalinist distortion, bureaucratic ossification, and the suppression of honest information. If you removed the distortions, restored honesty, gave the economy more flexibility, the system would recover its vitality. Socialism would work the way it was supposed to work. The theory was wrong. Not wrong in every particular, but wrong in the specific way that mattered most. The problems of the Soviet system were not accidental corruptions of a sound foundation. They were expressions of the foundation itself. Central planning could not allocate resources as efficiently as markets. One-party rule could not generate the honest information that effective governance required. An ideology that required the suppression of inconvenient truths could not coexist with the transparency that modern societies needed to function. These were not bugs. They were features, built into the system's architecture from the beginning. Gorbachev's reforms, glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring, were designed to address symptoms without touching the underlying causes. And in addressing the symptoms, they released pressures that the system had been containing by force. Glasnost began as a policy of permitting more honest reporting about Soviet society and its problems. It was not designed to permit questioning of the system's legitimacy or the party's right to rule. But once honest reporting was permitted about some things, it proved impossible to contain selectively. The logic of honesty, taken seriously, led to questions the system could not answer without indicting itself. The history that emerged under glasnost was devastating. Stalin's crimes, the scale of which had been officially minimized for decades, were acknowledged in a specificity that the population found both revelatory and traumatic. The Gulag had been real. The famines had been real. The mass deportations had been real. The people who had died in them had not been enemies of the people in any meaningful sense. They had been citizens of the Soviet Union, killed by the state that claimed to represent them. In the Baltic republics, the conclusions were drawn with particular speed and clarity. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had been independent nations until 1940, when Soviet annexation under the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany had incorporated them into the Soviet Union. Under Glasnost, the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact could finally be acknowledged. And once acknowledged, the legal foundation of Soviet rule over the Baltics became a political question rather than a settled historical fact. On August 23, 1989, the 50th anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, approximately 2 million people formed a human chain stretching 600 kilometers from Tallinn through Riga to Vilnius. The Baltic Way was the largest peaceful political demonstration in the history of the Soviet Union. It did not demand better socialism. It demanded independence. Gorbachev did not send troops. This was the decision that determined everything that followed. His reasons involved his genuine commitment to reform, his concern for his international reputation, and his judgment that military suppression in the age of glasnost and satellite television would destroy the reform program's credibility. He may also have miscalculated how far the independence movements would go and how quickly. Whatever his reasoning, the decision established a precedent. Political expression in the Soviet Empire would not automatically be met with force. The Brezhnev Doctrine, which had justified Soviet military intervention to preserve communist governments in Eastern Europe, as demonstrated in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968, was effectively abandoned. When this became clear, the consequences cascaded with a speed that left everyone, including the people participating in the cascade, struggling to process what was happening. Poland had already moved furthest. The Round Table Agreement of Spring 1989 between the communist government and Solidarity, the independent trade union that had been suppressed under martial law in 1981 but had continued to exist underground throughout the decade, provided for partially free elections in June. Solidarity won every contested seat. By August, Solidarity's Tadeusz Mazowiecki was prime minister, the first non-communist to lead a Warsaw Pact country since the 1940s. Gorbachev did not intervene. Hungary opened its border with Austria in May 1989, creating a physical gap in the Iron Curtain. East Germans began streaming through that gap into the West by the thousands. East Germany, the country that had built a wall to prevent its population from leaving, was hemorrhaging its most mobile citizens through a hole it had not created and could not close without Soviet support that was not coming. The demonstrations that followed inside East Germany built from thousands to hundreds of thousands through October. Leipzig, on October 9th, was the pivot point. Security forces had been told to prepare for decisive action against the demonstrators. The order, whatever its precise content, was not implemented. The crowds went home safely. The following week, more came. The permission that had been implicitly granted by the decision not to act could not be rescinded. On the evening of November 9, 1989, an East German Communist Party spokesman named Günter Schabowski held a press conference to announce new travel regulations. He had been given the information shortly before and had not been fully briefed on the details. A journalist asked when the new regulations would take effect. Schabowski shuffled his papers. He looked at his notes. He said immediately, without delay, He was wrong. The regulations were supposed to take effect the following day with orderly procedures, but the press conference was being broadcast live. Within an hour, crowds had gathered at the Berlin Wall crossing points, demanding to be let through. The guards had no orders for this situation. One commander, at the Bornholmer Strasse crossing, facing thousands of people pressing against the barrier and unable to reach his superiors by telephone, made the decision to open the gates at approximately 11:30 that evening. East Berliners poured through into West Berlin for the first time since 1961. People who had been separated by a wall for 28 years embraced on streets the wall had made inaccessible. Someone produced a hammer and began chipping pieces off the concrete. Others joined. The Berlin Wall, the most visible symbol of the Cold War's division of Europe, fell not because of a military assault, not because of a diplomatic breakthrough negotiated over years, but because a party spokesman gave a wrong answer at a press conference and a checkpoint commander could not get his phone calls returned. Czechoslovakia followed within weeks. The Velvet Revolution bringing the playwright Václav Havel from prison to the presidency with a speed that compressed months of political change into days. Romania's Nicolae Ceausescu attempted to use force. It did not save him. He was arrested, given a trial that lasted roughly an hour, and executed with his wife on Christmas Day. The contrast with the bloodless revolutions elsewhere was stark. A reminder that the outcome of the autumn of 1989 was not inevitable, and that different choices at different moments might have produced very different results. Gorbachev watched all of this without sending troops. The Soviet Empire that had been held together by the credible threat of military intervention was discovering that once the threat was no longer credible, the only question was how quickly the structure would come down. Inside the Soviet Union, the same logic was operating with a lag. The August coup of 1991 was the last serious attempt to stop what was happening. On August 19th, senior Soviet officials, including the vice president, the prime minister, the defense minister, and the head of the KGB announced that Gorbachev was ill and that they were assuming power. Gorbachev was under house arrest at his vacation compound in Crimea. Soviet tanks appeared in the streets of Moscow. The coup organizers expected the restoration of Soviet order to proceed as such operations had in the past. What they encountered instead was a population that had spent 6 years under glasnost, developing a relationship with honest information and a sense of its own political agency that the coup's premise had not accounted for. Boris Yeltsin, the elected president of the Russian Federation, climbed onto a tank outside the Russian parliament building and called for resistance. Military units refused orders to move against civilians. The coup collapsed within 72 hours. On December 8, 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed an agreement in a hunting lodge in the Belovasia forest, dissolving the Soviet Union. They had not asked Gorbachev. They had not asked anyone. They had looked at what existed and decided that the entity they were nominally part of no longer functioned in any meaningful sense. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev appeared on Soviet television and announced his resignation as president of a country that no longer existed. The Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The Russian tricolor was raised. The Cold War was over. Not with the nuclear exchange that both sides had spent 45 years preparing for. Not with the conventional military assault that NATO had organized itself to resist. With a press conference that went wrong, a human chain across the Baltic, and a document signed in a hunting lodge by men who had decided the thing they were supposed to be running had already ceased to exist. Gorbachev had wanted to save the system. He had instead through the specific way he tried to save it, presided over its dissolution. Whether this makes him a tragic figure or a heroic one, or something that does not fit either category, is a question that historians and the Russian people themselves have not finished arguing. What is not arguable is that it happened without the catastrophe the Cold War had seemed, for 45 years, to be building toward. Stanislav Petrov was still alive. The missiles that had not existed on that September night in 1983 were being dismantled. The world had survived. Chapter 11. The End, and What It Left Behind. Consider what it felt like to be an ordinary Russian on the morning of December 26, 1991. Not a dissident. Not a communist true believer. Not a senior official with reasons to mourn or celebrate what had just happened. Just an ordinary person who had grown up in the Soviet Union, done military service, learned the approved version of history, stood at the approved ceremonies. Someone who had lived within the system because the system was what existed. The way water is what exists for a fish, not as a choice, but as the medium of daily life. The night before, Mikhail Gorbachev had appeared on television and announced his resignation as president of a country that, by the terms of the document signed in Belarus 17 days earlier, had ceased to exist. The Soviet flag had been lowered over the Kremlin, a flag that this person had seen at official ceremonies their entire life, that had meant something about who they were and where they fit in the world, was simply gone. What would such a person feel in that moment? Not triumph. Almost certainly. Not the grief of a committed communist whose ideology had been defeated. Something harder to name. A sudden awareness of exposure. Perhaps the framework that had organized everything, that had told them who their country was and what it stood for, and who the enemy was and why, was simply gone, and the world outside that framework was not yet legible. That feeling of a suddenly illegible world was not unique to Russians. It was the condition of the post-Cold War moment everywhere it was felt. The historian Martin Malia later wrote that the Soviet collapse arrived as a genuine surprise even to people who had been warning that something like it might eventually happen. The CIA had published assessments of Soviet economic weakness throughout the 1980s. Specialists had documented the system's structural problems in detail. None of them had predicted this specific sequence of events in this specific time frame. The event that ended the most consequential geopolitical competition of the 20th century arrived without the warning that the size of its consequences should have generated. The American reaction combined genuine triumph with a disorientation that the triumphalist narrative tended to obscure. The Cold War was over. The United States had won. If winning was the right word for what had happened, the country that had organized its economy, its military, its political culture, and its foreign policy around the Soviet threat since 1947 was now supposed to figure out what it was for when the thing it had been against no longer existed. The most intellectually influential American account of the moment came from a State Department analyst named Francis Fukuyama, whose essay titled The End of History. He appeared in the summer of 1989 and was expanded into a book in 1992. Fukuyama argued that the collapse of Soviet communism represented not merely the defeat of a specific adversary, but the resolution of humanity's fundamental ideological competition. Liberal democracy and market capitalism had demonstrated their superiority over all serious alternatives. The great argument about how society should be organized was effectively over. The thesis was quickly challenged in ways that Fukuyama's critics found revealing. The 1990s produced ethnic cleansing in the Balkans and genocide in Rwanda. Political Islam emerged as a global force, with its own comprehensive alternative to liberal democracy. China's economic rise did not produce the democratic political transformation that liberal theory predicted. The thesis was not wrong in the simple sense that bad things kept happening. It was challenged in a more specific sense. It underestimated how much of the Cold War's apparent stability had depended on the superpower competition suppressing other conflicts, other identities, and other grievances that reasserted themselves once the framework was removed. The most dangerous immediate consequence of the Soviet collapse received less public attention than it deserved. The Soviet Union had possessed, at the time of its dissolution, a very large nuclear arsenal. Its precise size was uncertain even to Western intelligence. Reflecting the opacity of Soviet record-keeping and the complexity of accounting for weapons across multiple categories and locations, these warheads were distributed across facilities in Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. The command and control systems, the security arrangements, and the institutional knowledge that maintained them had all been organized around a state that no longer existed. The weapons did not dissolve when the state did. They sat in facilities whose funding was suddenly uncertain, guarded by personnel who were not being reliably paid, in newly independent countries with unclear relationships to the Russian military establishment that theoretically controlled them. Senators Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar recognized the danger with a speed that the rest of Washington was slow to match. The Cooperative Threat Reduction Program they created provided American funding and technical assistance to secure, consolidate, and ultimately destroy Soviet-era nuclear weapons and materials. Over the following 2 decades, the program helped deactivate thousands of warheads, eliminate hundreds of ballistic missiles, and secure nuclear materials that might otherwise have become available to actors who should not possess them. The program was one of the most successful and least celebrated foreign policy achievements in American history. Its successes produced no dramatic images. The proliferation it prevented left no visible trace. It simply made the world measurably safer in ways that were invisible precisely because they worked. Ukraine, which had inherited the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, agreed under the Budapest Memorandum of 1994 to transfer all its nuclear weapons to Russia in exchange for security assurances from the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia. The assurances guaranteed Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. The Budapest Memorandum would become one of the most contested documents in post-Cold War international relations. When events beginning in 2014 raised serious questions about its effectiveness, observers drew different conclusions. Some argued the document demonstrated the futility of security assurances without enforcement mechanisms. Others, that its framers never intended it as the equivalent of a formal defense alliance. And still others that the specific circumstances its signatories faced had not been anticipated when it was written. What is not contested is that the gap between what the document promised and what it delivered in practice became a central question in debates about the post-Cold War security order. The countries and populations that had served as the Cold War's proxy battlefields received less sustained attention in the triumphalist atmosphere of the early 1990s than their situations warranted. Afghanistan was left, after the Soviet withdrawal and the subsequent American disengagement, with a devastated infrastructure, a traumatized population, and a collection of armed factions whose unity against the Soviets had been the only thing holding their alliance together. The civil war that followed was, in terms of daily suffering for ordinary Afghans, worse than the war against the Soviet Union itself. The instability that followed across Afghanistan and the wider region in the years after the Cold War ended had roots in the specific way the proxy conflict had been conducted. Though the precise connections between Cold War-era decisions and later events involve a complexity that simple before and after accounts tend to obscure. The expansion of NATO eastward, beginning with Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary in 1999 and continuing in subsequent rounds, was the post-Cold War decision with the most contested long-term implications. The historical record, examined by scholars, including Mary Elise Surratt, shows that American and German officials made statements in 1990 that Soviet interlocutors could reasonably have understood as suggesting limits on NATO expansion. No formal written commitment was made, and the statements were made in a context that events quickly overtook. From the perspective of Poland, or the Czech Republic, or Estonia, the logic of seeking NATO membership was straightforward. They had spent 4 decades under Soviet domination and had no desire to return to a condition in which their security depended on Russian goodwill. The right to seek security alliances of their own choosing was precisely the kind of national sovereignty the Cold War's end was supposed to restore. From Moscow's perspective, an alliance created to deter Soviet power was pressing against Russian borders after the Soviet threat that had justified its existence had disappeared. Both perspectives contained genuine historical and moral weight. The tension between them did not resolve itself in the 1990s. It accumulated, waiting for conditions that would force the question back to the center of world politics. The ordinary Russian of that December morning eventually found the new world legible, in the way that people find every world legible given time. The framework that had organized everything was gone. A different framework, imperfect and contested and still being negotiated, gradually replaced it. Whether it was better or worse depended on who you were and where you stood and what you had lost in the transition and what you had gained. The Cold War was over. The world it had made was not finished with itself. Chapter 12. Lessons for a New Cold War. Stanislav Petrov died on May 19, 2017, in his apartment in Fryazevo, a small town outside Moscow. He was 77 years old. His death was not announced immediately. It was discovered by a German activist named Karl Schumacher, who had been trying to reach him and who found, after weeks of unanswered calls, that Petrov had died months earlier. The news traveled through the internet in the way that news about people who had once been briefly famous travels a wave of attention. Articles, tributes, and then silence. Petrov had never been entirely comfortable with the attention he received in his last years. After the story of September 1983 became widely known, he gave interviews to journalists and documentary filmmakers who had tracked him down in Fryazevo. He answered their questions patiently. He accepted the awards that organizations sent him. He seemed, in the interviews, like a man who had genuinely not made peace with being famous for a judgment call. He had done, he said repeatedly, what seemed reasonable. He had not been certain. The machines had been saying one thing and his experience had been saying something else, and he had believed his experience. That was all. The journalists wanted a hero. Petrov kept offering them something more uncomfortable, a man who had guessed correctly. George Kennan was still alive when Petrov gave most of these interviews. Kennan died in 2005 at the age of 101. He had outlived the Soviet Union. He had spent his career studying, outlived the Cold War, whose intellectual framework he had helped create, outlived most of the men who had either built on his ideas or distorted them into something he did not recognize. In his last years, Kennan gave occasional lectures that expressed a concern about the direction of American foreign policy in the post-Cold War world that echoed, with remarkable fidelity, the concern he had expressed in 1947 and 1948. The temptation to translate the lessons of one historical moment into a universal doctrine, the substitution of military commitment for targeted political and economic engagement, the reduction of a complex world to a binary of aligned and unaligned. He had been saying this for nearly 60 years. He was not sure, by the end, that the people with the power to act on it had fully heard him. The Cold War's history, read honestly and completely, establishes several things with reasonable clarity. Most careful accounts would place the primary causes of the Soviet collapse inside the Soviet system itself, a system that could not tell itself the truth about its own performance, eventually stopped performing. Chernobyl did not cause the Soviet collapse. It revealed it. American pressure was a relevant factor throughout the Cold War, and the Reagan buildup imposed real costs on a Soviet economy already struggling. But the specific sequence of events that ended the confrontation was driven by Soviet internal dynamics that American policy could influence at the margins but did not determine. The lesson this history teaches is not that pressure alone defeats determined adversaries. It is that systems built on false premises eventually encounter the reality those premises deny. The Cuban Missile Crisis establishes something different and in some ways more disturbing. The 13 days of October 1962 were not resolved primarily because of brilliant strategy, though there was real skill on both sides. They were resolved because Vasily Arkhipov refused to authorize a nuclear torpedo launch on a submarine that believed it was under attack, because a U-2 pilot found his way back from Soviet airspace without being shot down after straying in by accident, because Kennedy overrode his military advisors at the critical moment, because Khrushchev accepted a compromise that his own hardliners opposed. None of these decisions were required by the systems these individuals were operating within. They were individual choices made under conditions of extreme stress and radical uncertainty, each of which went against the institutional momentum pushing toward escalation. As McNamara said in his old age, they lucked out. This is not a comfortable conclusion, but it is an honest one. And honesty about it matters not as historical humility, but as practical instruction for a world in which nuclear weapons still exist, in which new actors are acquiring or seeking to acquire them, and in which crisis management still depends on the judgment of human beings under pressures that no training program can fully simulate. The arms control framework that the Cold War produced, through decades of painful negotiation and mutual suspicion slowly giving way to habits of engagement, represented a genuine institutional achievement. The recognition that there were mutual benefits to limiting the competition in specific areas. The confidence various. That verification could provide confidence without requiring trust. That reducing the number of weapons pointing at each other was better than not reducing it. Produced agreements that made the world measurably safer. The erosion of that framework in the early 21st century, with arms control agreements expiring without replacement and new military technologies proceeding without established norms, represents the loss of institutional knowledge that took decades to accumulate and will not be quickly rebuilt. The Cold War also teaches something important about the costs of binary thinking in foreign policy. The reduction of every political situation to a contest between pro-American and pro-Soviet forces produced consequences that outlasted the Cold War by decades. The governments that American support helped install or maintain across the developing world created grievances that shaped the political landscape of those countries long after the Cold War ended, and the strategic rationale for American support had disappeared. The lesson is not that the Soviet threat was fabricated. It was real. The question was whether the binary framework was accurate enough to serve as a reliable guide to the full complexity of the situations it was applied to. The evidence suggests it frequently was not, and the cost was paid primarily by the populations of the countries where it was applied. What the Cold War does not straightforwardly teach is how to manage the strategic competitions of the present. The patterns that seem familiar in current great power competition are real enough to make the Cold War vocabulary feel applicable. The differences are real enough to make that vocabulary misleading if applied without care. The economic interdependence between major powers today has no Cold War equivalent. The nuclear arithmetic of a world with multiple nuclear powers and several smaller ones has no established management framework drawn from Cold War experience. The speed of information in a world of social media and satellite imagery creates crisis dynamics that no Cold War model fully captures. The Cold War is history. The questions it raised are not, how do societies manage competition between genuinely incompatible values without allowing that competition to destroy them both? How do institutions maintain the judgment and restraint that prevent moments of crisis from becoming moments of catastrophe? How does a world armed with weapons capable of ending civilization develop the political arrangements adequate to ensure they are never used? These questions were not answered by the Cold War's end. They were, in some ways, made more urgent by it. Petrov made a judgment call in a bunker in 1983 and got it right. The system he was part of was depending on him to get it right without having told him so. Without having given him the training or the authority or the institutional backing that the importance of the decision warranted, he got it right because he was, in that particular moment, the right person in that particular room. Kennan tried for 6 decades to give American foreign policy a framework precise enough to distinguish between the threats that required military response and those that required political and economic engagement. He was not always right, but the attempt, sustained across 6 decades and 4 American presidencies after his moment of influence had passed, represented exactly the kind of continuous, honest engagement with the question that the Cold War's management required and that managing its successors will require. Both men, in their different ways, understood something about the Cold War that the triumphalist accounts tend to obscure. The confrontation was survived not because the systems were adequate to it, but because, repeatedly, individual human beings were adequate in ways the systems had not guaranteed. That is the Cold War's most important legacy and its most urgent warning. The weapons still exist. The command and control systems still depend on human judgment under conditions of incomplete information and extreme stress. The margin that Arkhipov and Kennedy and Khrushchev and Petrov created has not been replaced by anything more reliable. It has simply been assumed, year after year, that the next crisis will be managed with the same combination of judgment and fortune that managed the last one. Whether that assumption is justified is the question the living have to answer, not history. The living